My name is Joaquin Restrepo, and I'm a translator who survived the first 8 hours of the zombie outbreak in Phoenix. When contaminated water turned people into flesh-eating monsters, my language skills became the difference between life and death. I watched my city burn, lost people I cared about, and discovered a government conspiracy that went deeper than anyone imagined. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comments section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Joaquin Restrepo, and I work as a freelance translator. For the past 15 years, I've been the bridge between languages in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. I've translated for UN peacekeepers in Haiti after the earthquake, worked with refugee families fleeing cartel violence in Mexico, and helped coordinate disaster relief efforts across Central America. I speak 7 languages fluently, and I've always believed that communication saves lives. On March 15, 2024, that belief was put to the ultimate test when Phoenix, Arizona became ground zero for something that still haunts my dreams. That morning started like any other Wednesday. I was sitting in the lobby of the Maricopa County Immigration Court, reviewing my notes for what should have been a routine asylum hearing. The Hernandez family had been waiting 3 months for this moment. Elena Hernandez, a former nurse from Mexico City, sat across from me with her parents, going over their testimony one final time. They had fled Michoacan after the cartels threatened to kill them for refusing to treat wounded cartel members at the hospital where Elena worked. Today was supposed to be their chance at safety, at a new beginning in America. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Mrs. Rodriguez, the court clerk who had been bringing me coffee every Wednesday for the past 2 years, moved between offices with her usual efficiency. Officer Martinez, the security guard who always joked about my ability to switch between languages mid-sentence, stood at his post by the metal detectors. The familiar hum of bureaucracy filled the air, punctuated by the occasional sound of legal documents being shuffled and the quiet conversations of families waiting for their hearings. But looking back now, I realized there were signs that something was wrong, signs that I should have noticed but dismissed as typical stress or fatigue. Mrs. Rodriguez kept scratching at her arms, leaving angry red marks on her skin. When I asked if she was okay, she said she had been dealing with a splitting headache since early morning and was having trouble concentrating. She looked pale, and there were dark circles under her eyes that I had never seen before. Officer Martinez mentioned during our brief chat that he had already seen 3 people collapse downtown that morning. He assumed it was the heat, even though March in Phoenix was nowhere near the scorching temperatures we experience in summer. One person had collapsed outside the Starbucks on Jefferson Street, another near the bus station, and a third in the parking garage of the county building next door. All 3 had been taken to St. Joseph's Hospital, where my wife Maria worked as a nurse in the emergency department. The courthouse janitor, Miguel, an elderly man who had been cleaning these halls for over a decade, looked particularly unwell. When I went to wash my hands in the bathroom around 10:30 that morning, I found him drinking straight from the tap. He was gulping down water like he had been walking through the desert for days. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and his hands were shaking. When I asked him in Spanish if he needed medical attention, he just mumbled something about being thirsty and walked away. At exactly 2:47 that afternoon, my phone buzzed with an emergency alert. The message appeared first in English, then in Spanish, which was standard for Phoenix given our large Hispanic population. The text read, "Avoid all tap water, boil before drinking, seek immediate medical attention if experiencing fever, confusion, or aggression." I stared at the message for a moment, trying to process what I was reading. Water contamination warnings were not uncommon in Phoenix. We had dealt with E. coli outbreaks before, and there had been issues with chemical runoff from mining operations affecting smaller communities outside the city. But something about this alert felt different. The wording was more urgent, more specific. The inclusion of symptoms like confusion and aggression struck me as odd for a typical water contamination event. Alina looked up from her own phone, her face creased with worry. She had received the same alert, and as someone with medical training, she immediately understood the implications better than most. She turned to her parents and quickly explained the message in Spanish. Her father, Carlos, shook his head and said he had been drinking from the water fountain in the lobby just 20 minutes earlier. Alina's mother, Isabella, mentioned that she had used the bathroom sink to splash water on her face to cool down. The courthouse lobby began to fill with confused murmurs as more people received the alert. I could hear conversations in both English and Spanish as families tried to understand what was happening. Some people were calling relatives, others were trying to access news websites on their phones. The court staff moved with increased urgency, and I noticed several bailiffs speaking in hushed tones near the security checkpoint. That's when I heard the first scream. It came from the direction of the courthouse cafeteria, a high-pitched sound of pure terror that cut through the ambient noise like a knife. Everyone in the lobby froze, their conversation stopping mid-sentence. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard before, and I had worked in war zones where I had become accustomed to the sounds of violence and fear. Then I saw Mrs. Rodriguez. She came running down the main hallway, but her movement was wrong. Her usual graceful stride had been replaced by an erratic, almost mechanical gait. Her arms swung at odd angles, and her head jerked from side to side as if she was searching for something. But it was her eyes that made my blood run cold. They were completely bloodshot. The whites turned a deep red that made her look like she had not slept in days. Foam had gathered at the corners of her mouth, and her face was contorted into an expression of pure rage that I had never seen on her kind features before. Officer Martinez stepped forward, his hand moving instinctively to his radio. He called out to her, asking if she needed help, but she did not respond to his voice. Instead, she turned toward him with predatory focus and launched herself at him with inhuman speed. The attack was so sudden and vicious that Martinez had no time to react. She tackled him to the ground, and before anyone could process what was happening, she bit into his neck with such force that blood sprayed across the marble floor. The sound she made when her teeth tore into his flesh was not human. It was a growling, snarling noise that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. Martinez screamed and tried to push her off, but she held on with strength that seemed impossible for someone of her size. Other people in the lobby began screaming and running in different directions, but I found myself frozen in place, unable to believe what I was witnessing. That was the moment I knew this was not a normal water contamination event. I had seen enough disaster zones to recognize when everything was about to fall apart, when the thin veneer of civilization was about to crack and reveal the chaos underneath. But this was different from earthquakes or hurricanes or even armed conflicts. This was something that challenged the very nature of what it meant to be human. By 3:15 that afternoon, just 28 minutes after the emergency alert, downtown Phoenix had descended into complete chaos. The infected, though we did not call them that yet, began pouring out of office buildings, restaurants, and anywhere people had been drinking tap water throughout the day. They moved with the same jerky, unnatural gait that I had seen in Mrs. Rodriguez, and they all shared the same bloodshot eyes and foam-flecked mouths. What terrified me most was their speed. These were not the slow, shambling creatures from horror movies. They were fast, aggressive, and seemed to be driven by an insatiable hunger for human flesh. They attacked with coordination that suggested some form of communication or shared instinct. When one of them spotted a potential victim, others would converge on the same location within seconds. I grabbed Alina and her parents and pulled them toward the translation booth where I normally worked during hearings. The booth was constructed with thick, soundproof glass and had multiple exits, which I hoped would provide some protection while we figured out what to do next. More importantly, none of them had consumed any tap water since arriving at the courthouse that morning. Alina had brought bottled water from home, and her parents had been too nervous about their hearing to eat or drink anything. Through the glass walls of the booth, I watched the courthouse transform into a scene from a nightmare. The infected moved through the hallways with purpose, attacking anyone they encountered. But I noticed something that chilled me to the bone. They were not just attacking randomly. They seemed to be responding to sound and movement, turning toward screams and running footsteps like predators tracking prey. I started timing their behavior, using the clock on the wall as a reference point. Miguel, the janitor who had been drinking from the tap, stumbled out of the bathroom at exactly 3:21. He moved with the same unnatural gait, the same bloodshot eyes, the same foam at his mouth. From the time I had first noticed his symptoms that morning to his complete transformation, exactly 4 hours and 51 minutes had passed. The pattern was becoming clear. The incubation period was not random. It was consistent, predictable, and that meant this was not some natural contamination event. This was something deliberate, something engineered. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Someone had done this intentionally. My phone buzzed with another emergency alert, this one more specific. Martial law declared. Shelter in place. Do not attempt to leave your current location. But even as I read the message, I could see through the courthouse windows that the infection was spreading beyond the building. Downtown Phoenix was burning. Smoke rose from multiple locations, and I could hear the distant sound of sirens and what sounded like gunfire. I tried calling Maria at the hospital, but the call went straight to voicemail. I tried again and again, each time getting the same result. The phone networks were becoming unreliable, probably overwhelmed by the sheer volume of emergency calls. St. Joseph's Hospital would have been using tap water for everything throughout the day. Patients, staff, visitors, everyone would have been exposed. The thought of Maria facing what we were experiencing made my chest tighten with fear. Alina was monitoring the Spanish-language radio stations on her phone, providing translation for anything that might be useful. The Spanish stations were being more honest about the situation than their English counterparts. Instead of calling it a civil unrest situation or isolated incidents, they were reporting martial law, military deployment, and complete breakdown of emergency services. They were also reporting similar outbreaks in other major cities across the country. Los Angeles, San Diego, Las Vegas, Denver, Dallas, Houston, Miami, Atlanta, Chicago, Detroit, New York, Boston, Washington, D.C. The list kept growing. Every major metropolitan area with centralized water treatment facilities was reporting the same pattern of infection. The coordination was impossible to ignore. This was not a random contamination event. This was a coordinated attack on the American water supply system. The courthouse fire alarm suddenly blared to life, triggered by smoke from a fire that had started in one of the offices. The sound was deafening, echoing through the marble halls and bouncing off the high ceilings. But what terrified me was the immediate response from the infected. They all turned toward the sound, moving with purpose and coordination that suggested they were not just mindless predators. They were learning, adapting, responding to stimuli in ways that indicated some form of intelligence remained. Dozens of them began converging on our location, drawn by the alarm. They moved through the hallways like a pack of wolves, communicating with each other through grunts and snarls that seemed to carry meaning. Some of them were testing doors, looking for weaknesses in barriers, while others seemed to be coordinating their movements to surround potential escape routes. I realized our first critical mistake. The fire alarm was not just alerting us to danger, it was calling them to us, broadcasting our location to every infected person in the building. We were trapped in a glass box, surrounded by creatures that had once been our neighbors, our colleagues, our friends, and they were all converging on us with single-minded purpose. Through the glass, I could see them pressing against the walls of the booth, their bloodshot eyes fixed on us with predatory hunger. Their faces were pressed against the glass, leaving bloody smears as they clawed at the surface. The sound of their fingernails scraping against the glass was like fingernails on a chalkboard, but amplified to an almost unbearable level. Elena was trying to keep her parents calm, speaking to them in soft Spanish, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Her medical training was helping her understand the situation better than most, but that knowledge was also making her realize just how hopeless our situation was becoming. She had recognized the symptoms of the infection, understood the progression, and knew that anyone who had consumed tap water in the past several hours was either already dead or would be soon. The infected were not just attacking the glass randomly. They were testing it, looking for weak points, and when one of them found a spot where the glass was slightly cracked, others immediately converged on that location. They were sharing information, coordinating their efforts, and that level of organization suggested that whatever had infected them had not completely destroyed their cognitive abilities. It had redirected them, repurposed them, turned them into something that retained intelligence but had lost all humanity. The fire alarm continued to blare, drawing more of them to our location. I could see them moving through the courthouse in organized groups, not the random wandering that I would have expected from mindless creatures. They were searching the building systematically, checking every room, every hiding place, every possible location where survivors might be concealed. I realized that we had to move. The translation booth was becoming a trap, and the fire alarm was ensuring that every infected person in the building knew exactly where we were. We needed to find a way out of the courthouse, but that meant leaving the relative safety of our glass sanctuary and moving through halls filled with creatures that had once been human. Elena grabbed my arm and pointed toward the rear exit of the booth. She had noticed something that I had missed in my focus on the infected pressing against the front glass. There was a service corridor that connected to the courthouse basement, a route that the infected had not yet discovered. It was our only chance of escape, but it meant moving through the building while the fire alarm continued to announce our every movement. The scraping sound against the glass was getting louder, more insistent. One of the infected had found a small crack in the glass and was working at it with mechanical persistence. The crack was starting to spread, spiderwebbing across the surface in a pattern that would soon compromise the entire panel. We had minutes, maybe less, before our barrier failed completely. As the crack in the glass spread like a spider web across the surface, I knew we had seconds before our protection failed completely. The infected were pressing harder against the weakened panel, their bloodshot eyes fixed on us with predatory hunger. I grabbed Elena's hand and motioned for her parents to follow us toward the service corridor she had spotted. Carlos and Isabella moved quickly despite their age, fear overriding any hesitation they might have had about following a stranger into the unknown depths of the courthouse. The service corridor was narrow and dimly lit, designed for maintenance workers rather than public access. As we moved away from the translation booth, I could hear the glass finally giving way behind us. The sound of shattering was followed immediately by the guttural snarls of the infected as they poured into the space we had just vacated. The fire alarm continued to blare, masking the sound of our footsteps as we descended into the basement level of the courthouse. The basement was a maze of storage rooms, mechanical equipment, and forgotten offices that had been converted into filing archives. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old paper, but it was mercifully quiet compared to the chaos above. I had been in this basement before during construction delays, when court sessions were moved to temporary locations. The layout was confusing, with corridors that seemed to lead nowhere and rooms that connected in ways that defied logic. Elena was translating in whispers for her parents, explaining our situation and trying to keep them calm. Her medical training was evident in how she assessed their physical condition and monitored their stress levels. She had noticed that her father was showing signs of fatigue, and her mother was struggling with the confined spaces. But more importantly, she was analyzing what we had witnessed upstairs with the clinical detachment of someone who understood infectious disease protocols. She pulled me aside and spoke in hushed English so her parents would not understand. She told me that the infection pattern we had observed was unlike anything she had encountered in her medical training. The incubation period was too consistent, the symptoms too specific, and the behavioral changes too coordinated to be a natural pathogen. She believed we were dealing with something that had been engineered, something designed to target specific neurological pathways while leaving other cognitive functions intact. Her theory was that the infected retained enough intelligence to coordinate and communicate, but had lost the neural pathways responsible for empathy, social bonding, and self-preservation. They had become perfect predators, driven by hunger and aggression, but still capable of strategy and learning. The implications were terrifying. These were not mindless zombies that could be easily avoided or outsmarted. They were evolving, adapting, and becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. As we moved deeper into the basement, I began to hear sounds that made my blood run cold. There were voices echoing through the corridors, but they were not human voices. They were the same guttural snarls and growls that we had heard from the infected upstairs, but they seemed to be following patterns, almost like a primitive form of communication. The infected were not just hunting randomly. They were coordinating their search, sharing information about our location and movements. I realized that every sound we made was being processed and analyzed by creatures that had once been human, but now possessed predatory instincts enhanced by retained intelligence. Every footstep, every whispered word, every creaking floorboard was providing them with data about our position and direction. We were being hunted by something that combined the relentless hunger of a wild animal with the problem-solving abilities of a human being. The radio in Alina's phone crackled with emergency broadcasts from around the city. The Spanish-language stations were providing more detailed information than their English counterparts, reporting that downtown Phoenix was completely overrun and that the National Guard was setting up checkpoints at major highway intersections. But the most disturbing news came from reports of similar outbreaks in other cities. The pattern was identical everywhere. Water contamination followed by rapid transformation, coordinated attacks, and complete breakdown of emergency services. I found myself thinking about the timeline again. Mrs. Rodriguez had shown symptoms early in the morning, hours before the emergency alert was issued. Miguel had been drinking from the tap when the contamination was already in the system. The first 911 calls had been reported at 11 in the morning, but the public was not warned until almost 4 hours later. Someone in authority had known about the infection and had chosen to delay the warning, allowing it to spread further before taking action. The basement corridors seemed to stretch endlessly, with storage rooms and mechanical spaces branching off in all directions. I was trying to remember the layout from my previous visits, looking for the tunnel system that connected the courthouse to the county building next door. The tunnels had been built during the Depression as part of a larger underground network that was supposed to connect all the government buildings in downtown Phoenix. Most of the tunnels had been sealed off over the years, but I remembered seeing maintenance maps that showed several still in use. As we moved through the basement, we encountered other survivors who had made the same decision to seek refuge underground. There was Judge Morrison, an elderly man who had been presiding over immigration cases for over 20 years. He had barricaded himself in his chambers when the chaos began, but had been forced to flee when the infected broke through his door. His left arm showed scratches that he claimed came from falling debris, but Alina's medical eye noticed that the wounds looked more like bite marks. There was also Maria Santos, a court translator like myself, who had been working in the family court when the outbreak began. She had witnessed the transformation of a bailiff who had been drinking coffee made with tap water throughout the morning. She described how the man had gone from normal behavior to complete transformation in less than an hour, attacking a family in the waiting room with savage brutality. Dr. Peterson, a psychiatrist who provided expert testimony in custody cases, had been trapped in the courthouse cafeteria when the first wave of infected had emerged. He had managed to escape by hiding in the kitchen freezer, but had seen dozens of people transformed in a matter of minutes. His clinical observations matched Alina's theory about the nature of the infection. The transformed individuals retained enough cognitive function to use tools, open doors, and coordinate their movements, but had lost all capacity for human emotion or social behavior. As our group of survivors grew, the dynamics became more complex. Fear makes people suspicious, and the stress of our situation was beginning to create tension between different individuals. Judge Morrison was trying to assert authority based on his position, while Dr. Peterson was analyzing everyone's behavior for signs of infection. Maria Santos was struggling with claustrophobia in the confined basement spaces, and the Hernandez family was dealing with the additional stress of language barriers and cultural differences. I found myself becoming the unofficial leader of our group, not because of any formal authority, but because my experience in crisis situations and my ability to communicate in multiple languages made me the natural coordinator. I had worked in refugee camps where resources were scarce and tensions were high. I understood how quickly cooperation could break down when people were scared and desperate. The radio broadcasts were becoming more disturbing as the hours passed. Reports were coming in from military units that had been deployed to contain the outbreak. The infection was spreading faster than they had anticipated, and conventional weapons were proving less effective than expected. The infected were not deterred by gunfire unless they sustained immediately fatal injuries. They continued to attack even with multiple bullet wounds, and their coordination made them difficult to predict and counter. Even more troubling were reports of the infected demonstrating new behaviors. They were using simple tools, opening doors that required problem-solving skills, and showing evidence of learning from their encounters with military forces. Some units reported that the infected were avoiding areas where they had previously encountered heavy resistance, suggesting that they were sharing information and adapting their tactics. Alina's theory about the infection was proving accurate. The pathogen was not destroying intelligence but redirecting it toward predatory behavior. The infected were becoming more dangerous over time, not less. They were learning from each encounter, developing new strategies, and coordinating their movements with increasing sophistication. As we moved deeper into the basement, I began to notice strange markings on the walls. They looked like scratches at first, but the patterns were too regular and deliberate to be random damage. They resembled some kind of primitive writing or directional indicators, as if someone or something had been marking territories or paths through the underground areas. The scratches were fresh, made within the past few hours, and they seemed to lead toward the older sections of the basement. The smell in the basement was changing as well. The dusty odor of old paper and mechanical equipment was being replaced by something more organic and disturbing. It reminded me of the field hospitals I had worked in after natural disasters, where the smell of human suffering lingered in the air long after the immediate crisis had passed. But this was different, more concentrated, and it seemed to be getting stronger as we moved toward the tunnel entrances. We found the entrance to the old tunnel system behind a heavy steel door marked with warnings about authorized personnel only. The door was unlocked, which surprised me until I realized that someone else had been here recently. The handle was warm to the touch, and there were fresh scratches around the lock mechanism. Someone had forced the door open from the inside, not the outside. Alina examined the scratches with her medical training, noting that they were made by human fingernails but with a force and desperation that suggested someone in extreme distress. The scratches went deep into the metal, requiring strength beyond what a normal person could generate. She looked at me with understanding in her eyes. Someone who had been infected but retained enough intelligence to operate the door mechanism had opened this entrance. The tunnel beyond the door stretched into darkness, lit only by emergency lighting that cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. The air was thick with humidity, and the smell was much stronger here, making it difficult to breathe without feeling nauseous. The tunnel was wide enough for two people to walk side by side, but the ceiling was low, creating a sense of claustrophobia that made everyone uncomfortable. Dr. Peterson was analyzing the psychological impact of our situation on the group. He noted that the stress of being underground, combined with the constant threat of attack, was beginning to affect everyone's decision-making abilities. People were becoming more paranoid, more likely to interpret ambiguous situations as threatening, and more prone to making impulsive decisions based on fear rather than logic. Judge Morrison was struggling with the reality that his position and authority meant nothing in our current situation. He kept trying to make decisions for the group based on his courtroom experience, but crisis survival required different skills and different types of leadership. His frustration was beginning to manifest as anger directed at anyone who questioned his suggestions. Maria Santos was dealing with panic attacks triggered by the confined spaces and the constant stress of our situation. Her translation skills were valuable, but her emotional state was becoming a liability that could compromise the safety of the entire group. Elena was trying to help her manage the anxiety, but without proper medication or therapy, her condition was likely to worsen. The Hernandez family was holding together better than the others, perhaps because they had already experienced trauma and displacement in their journey to America. They understood that survival sometimes required making difficult choices and accepting uncertain outcomes. Carlos and Isabella were following Elena's lead, trusting her medical knowledge and her ability to communicate with the rest of the group. As we prepared to enter the tunnel system, I realized that we were crossing a threshold from which there might be no return. The courthouse basement had been dangerous, but it was familiar territory with known exits and understood risks. The tunnels were completely unknown, potentially filled with infected individuals who had been driven underground by the chaos above. But staying in the courthouse was no longer an option. The infected were systematically searching every room, every hiding place, every possible location where survivors might be concealed. Their search patterns were becoming more sophisticated, suggesting that they were learning from experience and sharing information about the building's layout. The fire alarm had finally stopped, but the silence was even more disturbing than the constant noise had been. Without the alarm to mask our movements, every sound we made echoed through the basement corridors. The infected would be able to track our location more easily, and we would be able to hear them approaching from greater distances. Elena checked her phone one more time before we entered the tunnels. The battery was running low, and the signal was weak, but she managed to pick up one more radio broadcast that changed everything. The reporter was describing military operations at Luke Air Force Base, where the National Guard was supposedly establishing a safe zone for civilian refugees. But the details of the report did not match the official statements that had been released earlier. The military was not accepting civilian refugees. They were establishing a research facility to study the infection and develop countermeasures. The safe zone was reserved for military personnel and government officials. Civilians were being turned away at gunpoint, told to seek shelter in their own communities. The government was abandoning the people of Phoenix, leaving them to face the infected alone. The tunnel entrance yawned before us like the mouth of a cave, dark and forbidding. The smell emanating from within was almost overwhelming, a mixture of decay and something else that I could not identify. The emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the walls, creating the illusion of movement in the darkness beyond our vision. As we stepped into the tunnel, I heard something that made my blood freeze. It was the sound of scraping, like fingernails on concrete, coming from somewhere in the darkness ahead of us. But it was not random scraping. It was rhythmic, purposeful, as if someone was marking the walls with deliberate intent. The sound echoed through the tunnel, making it impossible to determine exactly where it was coming from or how far away it might be. Alina grabbed my arm and whispered that we needed to be prepared for the possibility that the tunnels were not empty. The infected had been driven underground by the military operations above, and they might have established some kind of presence in the tunnel system. Her medical knowledge was telling her that the smell in the tunnels was not just decay, but something more organized, more purposeful. The scraping sound continued, growing louder as we moved deeper into the tunnel. It was joined by other sounds, low guttural noises that seemed to be coming from multiple directions. The infected were not just hiding in the tunnels. They were living in them, organizing themselves, creating some kind of community or nest in the darkness below the city. The scraping sounds in the tunnel grew more distinct as we moved forward, and I realized they were not random. The infected were marking territory, creating some kind of communication system that allowed them to navigate and coordinate in the darkness. Alina whispered that the patterns might be serving the same function as pheromone trails used by insects, except these were visual and tactile markers that could be read by touch, even in complete darkness. We had been moving through the tunnel for about 20 minutes when we encountered our first evidence of organized infected activity. The walls were covered with fresh scratches that formed complex patterns, almost like a primitive writing system. The scratches were made at different heights, suggesting that multiple infected individuals had been working together to create these markings. Some of the patterns were repeated every few yards, while others appeared to be unique to specific locations. Dr. Peterson was studying the markings with the analytical mind of someone trained in human behavior. He noted that the patterns showed evidence of planning and coordination that required abstract thinking. The infected were not just reacting to immediate stimuli, they were creating systems for future reference. This level of cognitive function suggested that whatever pathogen had caused the transformation had enhanced certain mental abilities while suppressing others. Judge Morrison was becoming increasingly agitated as we moved deeper into the tunnel system. His scratched arm was showing signs of infection, with red streaks extending from the wound toward his shoulder. Alina had been monitoring his condition discreetly, but the symptoms were becoming impossible to hide. His temperature was rising, he was sweating despite the cool air in the tunnel, and his behavior was becoming more erratic and aggressive. The smell in the tunnels was becoming overwhelming, a mixture of decay, human waste, and something else that Alina identified as the pheromone signature of the infected. She explained that the pathogen seemed to alter human biochemistry in ways that created distinct odors, possibly to help the infected identify each other and coordinate their activities. The concentration of the smell suggested that large numbers of infected had been using these tunnels for extended periods. As we moved deeper into the tunnel system, we began to hear radio chatter from emergency responders on Alina's phone. The National Guard units were reporting that downtown Phoenix was completely overrun and that they were falling back to establish a perimeter around the metropolitan area. Military helicopters were conducting reconnaissance flights, but they were reporting organized movement patterns among the infected that suggested coordinated behavior. The most disturbing reports came from military observers, who described the infected gathering in large groups and moving with apparent purpose toward specific locations. They were not wandering aimlessly, but seemed to be following predetermined routes toward objectives that made strategic sense. Some groups were moving toward hospitals and medical facilities, others toward food distribution centers and water treatment plants. Alina's medical analysis of these reports was chilling. She believed the infected were targeting infrastructure that would be essential for survivor communities. They were not just hunting individual humans, they were working to eliminate the resources that human survivors would need to rebuild civilization. This level of strategic thinking required planning abilities that challenged every assumption about the nature of the infection. The tunnel system was more extensive than I had realized, with branches leading in multiple directions toward different parts of downtown Phoenix. Some passages were blocked by debris or locked gates, while others showed clear signs of recent use by the infected. We were following the main tunnel toward the county building, but I was beginning to worry that we might encounter organized resistance before we reached our destination. Maria Santos was struggling with claustrophobia and panic attacks that were becoming more frequent and severe. The confined space, the disturbing smells, and the constant stress of our situation were overwhelming her ability to cope. Alina was trying to help her manage the anxiety, but without proper medication, her condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her panic attacks were also creating noise that could attract the infected to our location. Dr. Peterson noted that the psychological pressure of our situation was affecting everyone differently. Some people were becoming more focused and determined under stress, while others were breaking down mentally and emotionally. The key to group survival was recognizing these different responses and adapting our strategies accordingly. People who were becoming liabilities needed to be managed carefully to prevent them from compromising the safety of the entire group. The radio broadcasts were painting a picture of widespread chaos that extended far beyond Phoenix. Similar outbreaks were being reported in every major city across the United States, and international news sources were confirming that the phenomenon was global in scope. The coordination of the attacks suggested a level of planning and preparation that could only have been accomplished by a large organization with significant resources. Alina was monitoring Judge Morrison's condition more closely as his symptoms worsened. The red streaks from his arm wound were extending toward his chest, and his behavior was becoming increasingly aggressive and irrational. She quietly explained to me that he was probably in the early stages of transformation, and that we needed to be prepared to make difficult decisions about his presence in our group. The tunnel began to slope downward, leading us deeper underground than I had expected. The emergency lighting became more sporadic, with long stretches of complete darkness between functioning fixtures. We were using our phones as flashlights, but the battery levels were dropping rapidly, and we needed to conserve power for emergency communications. As we descended deeper into the tunnel system, we began to encounter evidence of more sophisticated infected activity. There were areas where debris had been cleared and arranged in specific patterns, creating barriers and pathways that seemed designed to control movement through the tunnels. The infected were not just using these spaces, they were modifying them to serve their purposes. Alina's analysis of these modifications was disturbing. The infected were demonstrating engineering skills that required spatial reasoning and planning abilities. They were creating funnel points where they could trap and overwhelm prey, escape routes that allowed them to retreat from superior forces, and communication hubs where multiple tunnel branches converged. The smell in the tunnels was becoming so strong that it was affecting our ability to think clearly. Alina explained that some pathogens could produce neurological effects through airborne transmission, and we might be experiencing early symptoms of exposure. The possibility that we could be infected without direct contact with contaminated water was terrifying, but there was no way to avoid exposure while moving through the tunnel system. We encountered our first infected individual in the tunnels at approximately 5:30 that afternoon. It was a woman in a business suit who had probably been working in one of the downtown office buildings when the outbreak began. She was crouched in an alcove, apparently sleeping or resting, but her eyes opened immediately when our flashlight beams illuminated her position. What struck me immediately was that she did not attack. Instead, she observed us with intelligent curiosity, studying our movements and behavior in a way that suggested analytical thinking. She made soft guttural sounds that seemed to be some form of communication, possibly alerting other infected to our presence without immediately triggering a confrontation. Alina whispered that this behavior was completely different from what we had observed in the courthouse. The infected in the tunnels seemed to be operating under different rules, showing restraint and strategic thinking that had not been evident in the initial attack phase. The woman in the business suit was evaluating us as potential threats or resources rather than simply attacking on sight. The woman began to move, but her movements were controlled and purposeful rather than the erratic aggression we had seen earlier. She was positioning herself to observe our group while maintaining escape routes and possibly coordinating with other infected in the area. Her behavior suggested that the infected were developing more sophisticated social structures and communication systems. Judge Morrison was becoming increasingly agitated, and I realized that his transformation was accelerating. His behavior was attracting attention from the infected woman, who seemed to recognize something familiar in his appearance or scent. Alina grabbed my arm and indicated that we needed to make a decision about Morrison before his condition attracted more infected to our location. The tunnel branched in multiple directions ahead of us, and we could hear movement coming from several different passages. The infected were coordinating their response to our presence, moving to surround us without launching an immediate attack. Their behavior was sophisticated enough to suggest that they were capable of setting traps and planning ambushes. Alina's medical training was providing insights into the progression of the infection that were both fascinating and terrifying. She believed that the pathogen was not just changing behavior, but was actually rewiring neural pathways to create new forms of intelligence. The infected were not becoming less human. They were becoming a different kind of human with different priorities and capabilities. The radio chatter on Alina's phone was reporting military encounters with large groups of infected that demonstrated unprecedented coordination and tactical awareness. Some units reported that the infected were using diversionary tactics, flanking maneuvers, and strategic retreats that suggested military-level planning capabilities. The infected were learning from each encounter and adapting their strategies accordingly. Dr. Peterson was analyzing the psychological implications of the infection from a clinical perspective. He noted that the infected seemed to retain memory and learning capabilities while losing emotional connections to their previous human relationships. They were becoming perfect predators, driven by logical assessment of threats and opportunities rather than emotional responses. As we moved through the tunnel system, I began to notice that the infected markings on the walls were becoming more complex and sophisticated. The early markings had been simple scratches and basic symbols, but the newer ones showed evidence of artistic expression and abstract representation. The infected were developing culture and communication systems that went beyond basic survival needs. The county building tunnel entrance was still several hundred yards ahead of us, but I was beginning to doubt whether we would be able to reach it safely. The tunnel system was clearly inhabited by organized groups of infected who had established territorial control over different areas. We were moving through their territory without permission, and they were coordinating a response to our intrusion. Alina's phone picked up a radio transmission that changed our understanding of the entire situation. The transmission was from a CDC researcher who had been studying the outbreak from a secure location outside the city. According to his report, the pathogen responsible for the infection was not a naturally occurring organism. It was a bioengineered weapon that had been designed to target specific neurological pathways while preserving cognitive function. The weapon had been developed as part of a classified military research program aimed at creating enhanced soldiers who could operate without emotional limitations or moral constraints. The pathogen was supposed to be delivered through aerosol systems in controlled environments, but something had gone wrong with the delivery mechanism. Instead of affecting small test groups, it had been introduced into the water supply systems of major cities. Alina's analysis of this information confirmed her earlier theories about the nature of the infection. The pathogen was not destroying intelligence, but was redirecting it toward different purposes. The infected retained human cognitive abilities, but had lost the neural pathways responsible for empathy, social bonding, and moral reasoning. They were becoming perfect killers who could think strategically, but felt no emotional connection to their former human lives. The implications were staggering. This was not a natural disaster or an accidental contamination event. It was a weapons test that had escaped containment and spread beyond its intended targets. Someone in the government had authorized the development of a pathogen that could turn human beings into intelligent predators, and that weapon was now loose in the population. Judge Morrison finally succumbed to the infection as we approached a major junction in the tunnel system. His transformation was rapid and violent, with his personality disappearing completely within a matter of minutes. Alina had been monitoring his condition closely, and she made the difficult decision to isolate him from the group before he could attack anyone. The newly transformed Morrison immediately began communicating with the infected woman who had been following us, using the same guttural sounds and gestures that seemed to constitute their communication system. Within minutes of his transformation, he was fully integrated into their social structure and was participating in what appeared to be tactical planning for dealing with our group. Alina explained that the rapid integration suggested that the pathogen included mechanisms for instant social bonding among the infected. They were not just individual predators, but were members of a new species with built-in cooperation and communication systems. The infected were becoming a collective intelligence that could coordinate activities across large areas and multiple groups. The tunnel junction ahead of us was clearly a major hub for infected activity, with multiple passages converging and evidence of extensive modification to create defensive positions and communication centers. The infected were using this location as a command center for coordinating their activities throughout the tunnel system and possibly the entire downtown area. As we approached the junction, I realized that we were walking into a trap that had been carefully planned and executed by intelligent adversaries who understood our limitations and motivations. The infected had been herding us toward this location, using our own survival instincts and decision-making processes to guide us exactly where they wanted us to go. Alina's medical knowledge was providing crucial insights into the behavior and capabilities of the infected, but it was also revealing the hopelessness of our situation. We were not just fighting a disease or dealing with mindless monsters. We were facing a new form of intelligent life that had been designed to be superior to human beings in every way that mattered for survival and combat. The sounds coming from the tunnel junction suggested that dozens of infected were waiting for us in the darkness ahead. They had had hours to prepare for our arrival, and they knew the tunnel system much better than we did. Our phones were running out of battery power, our food and water supplies were limited, and we had no weapons capable of dealing with organized resistance from intelligent adversaries. As we stood at the edge of the junction, trying to decide whether to advance or retreat, I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of coordinated movement from multiple directions, suggesting that the infected had surrounded us while we were focused on the junction ahead. We had walked into an ambush that had been planned with military precision and tactical sophistication. Alina looked at me with understanding in her eyes. We had reached the point where our survival depended on making choices that challenged everything we believed about human nature and moral behavior. The infected were no longer human in any meaningful sense, but they retained enough of their former selves to make killing them feel like murder. The tunnel system had become a maze controlled by intelligent predators who understood our psychology better than we understood theirs. Every decision we made was being anticipated and countered by adversaries who thought like humans but felt nothing for human life. We were trapped in a game where the rules had been designed to ensure our defeat. The sounds of coordinated movement were closing in from all directions as we stood at the tunnel junction, trapped between the organized infected ahead of us and the hunting parties that had been systematically herding us toward this location. Alina grabbed my arm and pointed toward a maintenance shaft that led even deeper underground, away from the main tunnel system. It was our only escape route, but it meant descending into areas of the underground network that had been abandoned for decades. The maintenance shaft was barely wide enough for one person at a time, and the metal ladder rungs were corroded and unstable. Carlos Hernandez went first, followed by his wife Isabella, then Maria Santos, who was struggling with her claustrophobia but understood that staying in the main tunnels meant certain death. Alina helped her parents navigate the narrow shaft while I covered our retreat, listening to the infected coordination, their search patterns in the darkness behind us. As we descended deeper underground, the air became thick with moisture, and the smell of decay that had been concentrated in these abandoned spaces for years. The maintenance level was part of the original underground infrastructure built during the 1930s, when Phoenix was much smaller, and the underground network was designed for a completely different urban layout. These tunnels had been sealed and forgotten as the city expanded above them. Alina's medical training was helping her understand the progression of symptoms that we were all experiencing, from prolonged exposure to the infected pheromones and possible airborne pathogens. She noted that our decision-making abilities were becoming impaired, our stress responses were heightened, and we were showing early signs of the neurological changes that preceded full transformation. The pathogen was designed to be transmitted through multiple vectors, not just contaminated water. The maintenance tunnels were filled with evidence of long-term infected habitation that was far more sophisticated than anything we had seen in the courthouse or main tunnel system. The walls were covered with complex markings that resembled written language, with symbols and patterns that suggested abstract thinking and cultural development. The infected had been using these spaces as a central hub for their activities throughout the downtown area. What I found most disturbing was the organization of the space itself. The infected had modified the tunnels to create distinct areas for different purposes. There were spaces that appeared to be living quarters, others that looked like workshops where they had been manufacturing tools and weapons, and larger areas that might have served as meeting halls or communication centers. The infected had created a functioning society in the abandoned underground infrastructure. Dr. Peterson was analyzing the psychological implications of what we were seeing with the clinical detachment that had helped him survive the initial outbreak. He noted that the infected were demonstrating cultural evolution at an accelerated pace, developing new social structures and communication systems within hours of their transformation. The pathogen had not just created individual predators, but had established the foundation for a new form of civilization. Alina discovered something in one of the workshop areas that changed our understanding of the infected capabilities. They had been manufacturing weapons from scavenged materials, creating bladed implements and projectile devices that showed sophisticated understanding of metallurgy and engineering principles. The infected were not just using their enhanced physical abilities, but were developing technology to amplify their advantages over human survivors. The radio broadcasts on Alina's phone were reporting military encounters with infected groups that were using manufactured weapons and coordinated tactics. Some units described attacks by infected individuals carrying spears made from construction materials. Others reported projectile weapons that could be accurately aimed over significant distances. The infected were rapidly developing a technological base that could challenge military superiority. Maria Santos was deteriorating rapidly under the psychological pressure of our situation, and her panic attacks were becoming more frequent and severe. Alina was trying to manage her condition with limited resources, but the stress of being underground combined with the constant threat of attack was overwhelming her ability to cope. Her behavior was becoming erratic and unpredictable, creating additional risks for the entire group. As we moved deeper into the maintenance tunnel system, we encountered evidence of infected experimentation that suggested they were studying human behavior and developing strategies for dealing with survivors. There were areas where they had constructed what appeared to be testing environments, spaces where they could observe and analyze human responses to different stimuli and situations. Alina's medical analysis of these experimental areas was terrifying. The infected were conducting research into human psychology and physiology, gathering data that would help them become more effective predators. They were learning to anticipate human behavior, understand human weaknesses, and develop countermeasures for human survival strategies. The infected were becoming more dangerous with each passing hour as they accumulated knowledge about their prey. The tunnel system was much more extensive than any of the official maps had indicated, with passages that connected to subway lines, utility tunnels, and other underground infrastructure that spanned the entire metropolitan area. The infected had access to a hidden transportation network that allowed them to move undetected throughout the city while coordinating their activities across multiple locations. Dr. Peterson noted that the infected social structure appeared to be based on specialized roles rather than simple hierarchy. Some individuals seemed to be scouts who gathered information about human survivors, others were builders who modified the tunnel environment, and still others appeared to be strategists who planned complex operations. The infected had developed a division of labor that maximized their collective effectiveness. We encountered our first evidence of infected leadership when we discovered a chamber that had been converted into what could only be described as a command center. The walls were covered with detailed maps of the city, marked with symbols that indicated the locations of survivor groups, military positions, and resource targets. The infected were conducting strategic planning that demonstrated understanding of urban warfare and resource management. Elena discovered documents in the command center that had been taken from government offices and medical facilities. The infected were collecting information about emergency response protocols, medical supplies, and civilian evacuation plans. They were using human intelligence to anticipate official responses and develop countermeasures that would neutralize government efforts to contain the outbreak. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that the infected were communicating with similar groups in other cities. Radio equipment in the command center was tuned to frequencies used by infected groups in Los Angeles, Denver, and other metropolitan areas. The outbreak was not a series of isolated incidents, but was part of a coordinated global operation managed by the infected themselves. Elena's medical knowledge helped her understand the documents we found in the command center, which included classified CDC research into the pathogen that had caused the outbreak. The documents confirmed that the bioweapon had been developed over several years as part of a military enhancement program, but they also revealed that the outbreak had not been accidental. Someone with access to the research had deliberately introduced the pathogen into water supply systems. The radio communications between infected groups suggested that they were sharing tactical information and coordinating their activities across continental distances. The infected in Phoenix were receiving instructions and updates from similar groups in other cities, creating a network of intelligent predators that could adapt their strategies based on successes and failures in different locations. As we moved through the command center, I realized that we were not just dealing with the aftermath of a failed experiment or accidental contamination. We were witnessing the emergence of a new form of intelligent life that had been specifically designed to replace human civilization. The infected were not just survivors of a catastrophe. They were the intended result of a deliberate plan to transform humanity. Elena found evidence in the medical documents that the pathogen included genetic modifications that would allow the infected to reproduce and pass their enhanced characteristics to offspring. The bioweapon was not just creating individual predators, but was establishing the foundation for a new species that would be evolutionarily superior to baseline humans. The infected were the first generation of humanity's replacement. Dr. Peterson's psychological analysis of the infected communications revealed that they were developing philosophical and cultural frameworks that justified their actions against human survivors. They viewed themselves as an evolutionary advancement that had transcended the limitations of human emotion and morality. The infected believed they were saving the planet by eliminating an inferior species that had proven incapable of managing its resources responsibly. Maria Santos finally succumbed to the psychological pressure of our situation when she discovered a room filled with human remains that had been systematically processed for food. The infected were not just killing humans for territory or resources, they were consuming them as a regular part of their diet. The sight of organized cannibalism broke Maria's remaining mental defenses, and she began screaming uncontrollably. Alina was forced to make the difficult decision to sedate Maria using medications she had found in the command center medical supplies. Maria's screaming was attracting infected attention from throughout the tunnel system, and we could hear them responding to her calls with coordinated movement toward our location. Alina's medical training allowed her to calculate the proper dosage to render Maria unconscious without killing her. The infected response to Maria's screaming demonstrated the sophisticated communication network they had established throughout the underground system. Within minutes of her first scream, we could hear infected converging on our position from multiple directions. They were using the tunnel acoustics to triangulate our location and coordinate their approach with military precision. Alina's analysis of the medical supplies in the command center revealed that the infected were stockpiling medications and equipment that would be useful for human experimentation. They were not just studying human behavior through observation, but were conducting active research that involved surgical procedures and chemical testing. The infected were using captured humans as laboratory subjects to better understand their prey. We discovered evidence that some humans were being kept alive in the tunnel system for extended periods, not as food sources, but as test subjects for infected research into human psychology and physiology. The infected were learning to manipulate human behavior through psychological conditioning and chemical modification. They were developing techniques for controlling human survivors rather than simply eliminating them. The command center also contained evidence of infected infiltration into military and government facilities. They had been capturing personnel with access to classified information and using interrogation techniques to extract intelligence about official response plans. The infected were staying ahead of government countermeasures because they had access to the same information that was being used to plan those countermeasures. Alina found communications equipment that allowed us to monitor infected radio traffic between different groups throughout the city. The infected were coordinating attacks on military checkpoints, resource distribution centers, and survivor communities with timing that suggested central planning and command authority. They were fighting a war against human civilization with strategic objectives and tactical coordination. The radio traffic revealed that the infected had identified key infrastructure targets that would cripple human survival capabilities if destroyed. They were planning coordinated attacks on power plants, water treatment facilities, and food distribution networks that would eliminate the resources necessary for human communities to survive independently. The infected were working to create conditions that would force human survivors to depend on them for basic necessities. Dr. Peterson noted that the infected strategic planning demonstrated understanding of human social psychology that went beyond simple predatory behavior. They were manipulating human group dynamics, creating situations that would cause survivor communities to fragment and turn against each other. The infected were using psychological warfare to weaken human resistance before launching physical attacks. As we listened to the infected radio communications, I realized that our escape from the courthouse had been anticipated and planned by the infected leadership. They had been herding us through the tunnel system toward this command center, allowing us to discover their capabilities and intentions for reasons that were not yet clear. We had not been escaping from the infected. We had been following a path they had designed for us. Alina's medical analysis of our situation revealed that we were all showing advanced symptoms of pathogen exposure that would lead to transformation within hours. The airborne transmission vector was more aggressive than the waterborne version, and our prolonged exposure in the tunnel system had accelerated our infection timeline. We were running out of time to reach safety before we became part of the infected collective. The command center contained detailed maps of the entire Phoenix metropolitan area, marked with the locations of survivor communities that the infected had identified for future operations. They knew where people were hiding, what resources they had access to, and what their defensive capabilities were. The infected were planning systematic elimination of human resistance over the coming days and weeks. Alina discovered that the infected had been monitoring emergency radio frequencies and intercepting communications between military units and government agencies. They had access to real-time intelligence about official response efforts, allowing them to anticipate and counter every attempt to contain or eliminate them. The infected were fighting with information superiority that made conventional military tactics ineffective. The most disturbing revelation came when Alina found communications indicating that infected groups in other cities had successfully infiltrated government facilities and were operating from within official response organizations. The outbreak was not just a military attack, but was also an infiltration operation designed to corrupt human institutions from within. As we prepared to leave the command center and continue our desperate search for safety, I realized that we were not just fleeing from infected predators, but were escaping from the birthplace of a new form of intelligent life that had been designed to replace everything we understood about human civilization. The tunnels were not just hiding places for monsters. They were the capital city of humanity's evolutionary successor. Alina grabbed communication equipment from the command center that would allow us to monitor infected radio traffic as we continued our escape. Understanding their coordination and planning might give us the advantage. We needed to avoid their patrols and reach safety before our own transformation became irreversible. But even as we prepared to leave, I could hear them closing in on our position with the methodical patience of predators who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. The infected radio equipment we had taken from the command center crackled with coordinated communications as we made our way through the deepest levels of the tunnel system. Alina was monitoring their transmissions while trying to navigate us toward an exit that would not lead directly into their patrol routes. The infected were conducting systematic sweeps of the underground network, closing off escape routes with the methodical precision of experienced hunters who had learned to anticipate human behavior. Carlos and Isabella Hernandez were struggling with the physical demands of our underground journey, but their experience fleeing cartel violence in Mexico had given them the mental resilience to keep moving despite exhaustion and fear. Alina was supporting her parents while also managing the unconscious Maria Santos, whose sedated condition made her dead weight that slowed our progress through the narrow maintenance passages. Dr. Peterson's psychological analysis of our deteriorating situation was becoming increasingly clinical as his own transformation symptoms advanced. He noted that we were all showing signs of the neurological changes that preceded full infection, including heightened aggression, reduced empathy, and altered decision-making processes. The pathogen was rewiring our brains even as we fought to maintain our humanity and reach safety. The radio communications revealed that the infected had identified our location in the command center and were coordinating a massive search operation to prevent our escape. They were using terminology and tactical concepts that suggested military training, but their coordination was too perfect, and their response too rapid for normal human capabilities. The infected were operating with collective intelligence that allowed them to share information instantaneously across their entire network. Alina's medical knowledge was helping her understand the transformation process that we were all experiencing as the pathogen advanced through our systems. She explained that the bioweapon had been designed to preserve cognitive function while eliminating emotional connections and moral constraints. We were becoming more intelligent and more capable even as we lost our capacity for human compassion and social bonding. As we moved through the abandoned sections of the tunnel system, we encountered evidence of infected engineering projects that demonstrated technological capabilities far beyond what should have been possible in the hours since the outbreak began. They had constructed complex mechanical systems for air circulation, water purification, and waste management that suggested understanding of advanced engineering principles. The infected were building permanent infrastructure for long-term habitation of the underground network. The radio traffic indicated that infected groups throughout the city were coordinating attacks on military positions with timing that suggested central command authority. They were not just defending their territory, but were actively seeking to eliminate organized human resistance. The infected understood that military forces represented the greatest threat to their emerging civilization and were working systematically to neutralize that threat. Alina discovered that the infected communications included references to similar operations in other countries, suggesting that the outbreak was part of a global transformation that had been planned and coordinated across continental distances. The bioweapon attack on Phoenix was just one component of a worldwide operation designed to replace human civilization with something that its creators considered evolutionarily superior. Dr. Peterson noted that our group dynamics were changing as the infection advanced through our systems. We were becoming less concerned with individual survival and more focused on collective objectives. The pathogen was programming us to prioritize group success over personal safety, creating social bonds based on shared purpose rather than emotional attachment. We were becoming more like the infected even as we fought against them. The tunnel system connected to utility corridors that provided access to the infrastructure supporting downtown Phoenix. Alina realized that the infected were using these connections to sabotage power, water, and communication systems that human survivors depended on for coordination and survival. They were conducting infrastructure warfare designed to isolate survivor communities and prevent organized resistance. As we climbed toward the surface through a utility shaft that led to the basement of an office building, Alina's radio picked up transmissions from military units that were reporting unprecedented casualties from infected attacks. The bioweapon had not just created individual predators, but had established the foundation for a new form of warfare that conventional military tactics could not effectively counter. The office building basement was filled with the bodies of people who had been working late when the outbreak began. But these were not random victims of infected attacks. The bodies had been arranged in specific patterns that suggested ritual significance, and many showed evidence of surgical modification that indicated the infected were conducting experiments on human corpses to better understand human anatomy and physiology. Alina's medical examination of the bodies revealed that the infected were harvesting specific organs and tissues for purposes that she could not immediately determine. The surgical techniques were sophisticated and precise, suggesting that some of the infected retained the medical knowledge and manual skills they had possessed before transformation. The infected were not just destroying human civilization, but were studying it to understand its weaknesses. Dr. Peterson's analysis of the arranged bodies indicated that the infected were developing cultural practices and belief systems that justified their actions against human survivors. The ritual positioning suggested that they viewed humans as inferior beings whose elimination was necessary for the advancement of their superior species. The infected were not just predators, but were zealots who believed in the righteousness of their cause. The radio communications revealed that infected groups were coordinating with international networks that suggested the outbreak had been simultaneously triggered in major cities around the world. Phoenix was not an isolated incident, but was part of a global transformation that had been planned to occur simultaneously across multiple continents. The scope of the operation implied resources and planning capabilities that could only have been provided by major government or corporate entities. Alina found evidence in the office building that some humans were collaborating with the infected, providing intelligence and assistance in exchange for protection or enhanced status within the new social order. The bioweapon had not affected everyone equally, and some individuals were able to maintain their human consciousness while gaining enhanced physical and mental capabilities. These collaborators were serving as intermediaries between the infected and remaining human populations. As we made our way through the office building toward street level, Alina's radio picked up transmissions indicating that the infected had successfully infiltrated military command structures and were providing false intelligence to human forces. The outbreak was not just a biological attack, but was also a sophisticated information warfare operation designed to turn human institutions against themselves. The office building windows provided our first view of downtown Phoenix since we had fled the courthouse hours earlier. The city was burning, but the destruction was not random chaos. The infected had systematically targeted specific buildings and infrastructure while preserving others that would be useful for their purposes. They were conducting urban warfare with strategic objectives that demonstrated understanding of modern military doctrine. Alina's medical analysis of our condition revealed that we had reached the point where transformation was becoming irreversible. The pathogen had advanced through our systems to the point where our brain chemistry was fundamentally altered, but we retained enough human consciousness to understand what was happening to us. We were becoming witnesses to our own evolution into something that was no longer entirely human. Dr. Peterson noted that our group was beginning to communicate more efficiently and coordinate our movements with less verbal discussion. The pathogen was enhancing our ability to work together while reducing our need for emotional connection and individual autonomy. We were becoming more like a military unit and less like a family or friendship group. The radio traffic revealed that infected groups were coordinating attacks on hospital and medical facilities to eliminate human access to medical supplies and treatment capabilities. They understood that medical care was essential for human survival and recovery, and they were working to ensure that injured or sick humans would not be able to receive the treatment they needed to survive. Alina discovered that the infected were stockpiling medical supplies and equipment for their own use, suggesting that they were vulnerable to injury and disease despite their enhanced capabilities. The bioweapon had created superior predators, but it had not made them invulnerable. Understanding their medical needs might provide insight into weaknesses that could be exploited by human survivors. As we prepared to leave the office building and attempt to reach the surface, Alina's radio picked up a transmission that changed everything we thought we understood about the outbreak. The transmission was from Dr. Sarah Chen, a CDC researcher who had been involved in the development of the bioweapon. She was broadcasting from a secure facility outside Phoenix, providing information that revealed the true scope and purpose of the global transformation. Dr. Chen explained that the bioweapon had been developed by an international consortium of scientists and military officials who believed that human civilization was facing inevitable collapse due to environmental destruction, resource depletion, and social conflict. They had created the pathogen as a solution to these problems, designing it to eliminate the emotional and social limitations that prevented humans from making rational decisions about resource management and population control. The outbreak was not an attack on humanity, but was intended as humanity's salvation. The infected were not monsters, but were the next stage of human evolution, designed to be capable of making the difficult decisions and taking the harsh actions necessary to ensure species survival. The consortium believed that emotional attachment, moral constraints, and individual autonomy were evolutionary weaknesses that had to be eliminated for humanity to survive in a resource-limited world. Alina's medical knowledge helped her understand the full implications of Dr. Chen's revelation. The The bioweapon had been designed to preserve human intelligence and capabilities, while eliminating the psychological characteristics that the consortium considered maladaptive. The infected were not becoming less human. They were becoming what the consortium believed humans needed to become to survive the challenges of the 21st century. Dr. Peterson's psychological analysis of this information revealed that we were witnessing the implementation of a philosophical solution to existential problems that had been troubling human civilization for decades. The consortium had decided that human nature itself was the primary obstacle to human survival, and they had created a biological solution to what they saw as a psychological problem. The radio transmission from Dr. Chen also revealed that the transformation process was not complete. The pathogen included mechanisms for controlled evolution that would allow the infected to continue developing new capabilities over time. The current generation of infected was just the beginning of a transformation process that would continue for years or decades, creating increasingly advanced forms of post-human intelligence. Alina realized that our own transformation was part of this evolutionary process. We were not dying or becoming monsters. We were becoming members of a new species that had been designed to replace baseline humanity. The consortium had planned for some humans to survive the initial outbreak and undergo gradual transformation, creating a bridge population that could help manage the transition between the old and new forms of human civilization. As we climbed the stairs toward the office building's main floor, Alina's radio picked up transmissions indicating that infected groups around the world were beginning to establish permanent settlements and governmental structures. They were not just eliminating human civilization, but were building its replacement according to principles that prioritized efficiency, sustainability, and rational resource management over individual freedom and emotional satisfaction. Dr. Peterson noted that our group was already beginning to think and plan according to these new principles. We were making decisions based on logical analysis of survival probabilities rather than emotional attachment to specific individuals or outcomes. The transformation was not just changing our biology, but was altering our fundamental approach to moral and ethical decision-making. The office building's main floor provided access to street level, but Alina's radio traffic indicated that the infected had established patrol routes that covered all major exit points from downtown buildings. They were not trying to prevent human escape, but were managing it according to their own strategic objectives. Some humans were being allowed to leave, while others were being captured or eliminated based on criteria that we did not yet understand. Alina's medical analysis suggested that the infected were selecting humans for different purposes based on their skills, knowledge, and genetic characteristics. Some were being eliminated as unsuitable for transformation. Others were being captured for experimentation or forced labor, and still others were being allowed to escape to serve as breeding stock for future generations of enhanced humans. As we prepared to leave the building and attempt to reach safety outside the downtown area, I realized that our escape was probably being managed by the infected according to their own plans for our future. We were not fleeing from our captors, but were following a path they had designed for us, moving toward a destination that would serve their purposes rather than our own. Alina's radio equipment allowed us to monitor infected communications as we moved through the city streets, and their transmissions revealed that they were tracking our movement and coordinating their response to ensure that we reached our intended destination. We were not escaping from the infected, but were being guided by them toward whatever role they had planned for us in their emerging civilization. The transformation of Phoenix was nearly complete as we made our way through the abandoned streets toward the edge of the metropolitan area. The infected had eliminated organized human resistance and had begun implementing their own governmental and social structures. The city was becoming the capital of a new form of human civilization that had been designed to solve the problems that had plagued the old one. Alina's medical knowledge and Dr. Peterson's psychological insights helped us understand that we were witnessing the birth of humanity's successor species. The infected were not our enemies, but were our evolutionary descendants, and our own transformation was making us part of their community, whether we wanted to be or not. The outbreak had not been an attack on human civilization, but had been its planned obsolescence and replacement. As dawn approached and we reached the outskirts of Phoenix, Alina's radio picked up transmissions from infected groups around the world reporting successful completion of their initial objectives. The global transformation was proceeding according to plan, with human civilization being systematically replaced by something that its creators believed would be more capable of ensuring species survival in an uncertain future. The first 8 hours of the outbreak had been just the beginning of a transformation process that would continue for years as the infected evolved and developed their capabilities. We had survived the initial phase, but we were no longer entirely human. We were becoming something new, something that had been designed to inherit the Earth and manage it more effectively than our predecessors had been able to do.